I have a serious talk on what in effect is a serious topic and I think a very serious political moment. The philosopher George Santayana had once famously said that, quote, "Those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it," end quote. It's a piece of wisdom that sounds compelling, but is dauntingly difficult to apply. History is, of course, like an ever-flowing stream that constantly changes its shape and its substance. It is a process in which no two eras, epochs, or moments are identical to any other. To learn from history is to make comparisons between one selective era and another whose boundaries are arbitrarily drawn. But given that each time frame is unique, what exactly are the data that we are comparing? Not only does history not stand still, but any historical event is the product of innumerable causes, some relatively obvious, others simply obscure. If historical precedents are going to be useful to us in helping to understand the present, or as Santayana implies, altering our present circumstances with a view towards bending them so that we will be better off in the future, then we must frame our comparisons very carefully and very tentatively. For as mentioned, no two historical periods are precisely alike, and the causes of each hazy at best. Hence, when authoritarianism is looming on the horizon, some people will conclude that, quote, "It's just like the 30s. What they mean, of course, is that we are about to witness the emergence of another Hitler, and with Hitler reborn, a new Holocaust will assuredly follow. Such talk is clearly alarmist, driven by emotion, I think intellectually responsible, and most likely wrong. It is wrong because the United States of the current era is not the same as Germany in the interwar years. But that does not mean that there are not similarities, and similarities should make us vigilant, and if sufficiently compelling, should spur us to organize opposition and counter movements. And so we come regrettably and fearfully to Donald Trump and the Donald Trump phenomenon. It is a phenomenon we have not seen before in American politics, or at least nowhere to this degree. Here is a man who would be President of the United States, arguably the most powerful position on earth, requiring therefore the most far-reaching commitment to responsibility. What we witness, however, is an unbridled narcissist whose sense of self-importance is proportionate to his political vacuity. He is essentially an unread man who pronounces political slogans but elaborates virtually no political program. He is vulgar, obscene, puerile, and his level of articulation, in view of the Boston Globe, does not surpass that of a fourth grader. Moreover, he seems to have no respect for the truth. His speeches are glutted with lies, claims that are simply made up and are contrary to fact, and he perpetually contradicts himself while claiming that his lack of consistency is a virtue and that it renders him unpredictable. Nuance and complexity seem to elude him, and he lays down his utterances in hyperbolic and absolute terms. His ego is so grandiose that he seems not to know that he does not know and doesn't seem to care. Neither do those who are flocking to him. But beyond these characteristics, Trump panders to the basest instincts of those who would be his followers. He appeals to the gut rather than to the mind. He knows how to stoke the fears and grievances of those to whom he appeals. He employs what are the worst tactics in the armamentarium of the demagogue, the demonization of minorities and portraying them as our enemies with the effect of building community among those whom he favors. Muslims, Mexicans, women, the disabled are among those whom he calumniates. And as we know, he has condoned, defended, and abetted violence as a justified tactic. He has done this at his rallies and by proclaiming that if he falls short of the needed delegates, or if he would have fallen short of the needed delegates at the Republican convention, there will be riots, which, if you think about it, is an indirect way of inciting them. So here we have a self-aggrandizing man who seems to crave the adoration of the crowd like some love-deprived child, reminding us incessantly that he is the best and the greatest and the smartest. When he is not praising himself as a strong leader with crude and retrograde references to his masculinity, his message centers on the dynamic that America has been weakened by stupid politicians and that our country continues to be built by those who are taking us for a ride, whether it be the Saudis or the Chinese. We are victims, and he alone will make America great again. And he will make America great again, not on the basis of policy, but as a result of the power of his personality. Indeed, it is his persona as a self-declared strongman that makes him attractive to his followers. Political program, facts, consistency, truth, and truthfulness are simply beside the point. It is these realities that make, I believe, Donald Trump a very scary figure. His popularity has implications beyond himself and causes us to rightly be concerned about the state of America's political fabric, the strength of our democracy, and our democratic future. We can't help but ask what the Trump phenomenon says about us now and what it portends for the American future. The media have long been comfortable in labeling Donald Trump a demagogue. But the question we need to ask, I think, is Donald Trump a fascist, as some are now beginning to claim? Is this assertion merely name-calling, or is there some substance to it? And should we be appropriately resistant and appropriately vigilant? To my mind, given the tension inherent in our current political moment and our current circumstance, this is an important, very important question to ask, and it should not be handled glibly. On the one hand, many feel, myself included, given Trump's authoritarianism and his disdain for democratic institutions, and moreover his appeal to an economically disenfranchised sector of the population who feels itself dispossessed from the America they knew and have lost hope for a better future, that the smell of fascism, at least the smell of fascism, is in the air. On the other hand, the invocation of the word fascism is tagged to very potent associations, to Hitler and Mussolini, who represent the greatest evils that history has vomited up. Hence, if we entertain that Donald Trump is a fascist, we should not come to hasty conclusions, but look at the question carefully and responsibly. Again, what hinges in the balance is that we, in the first instance, be precipitously alarmist and we commit an offense, therefore, to the memory of Hitler's victims, or that we blind ourselves to the dangers facing America and thereby do nothing to try to stop them. Perhaps a good place to start is to ask, what is fascism? What is fascism? The answer, in truth, is not readily at hand, and different historians and political theorists have different descriptions. One reason for the vagueness is probably because fascism, unlike political stances and ideologies such as conservatism, liberalism, or socialism, fascism does not have much of an intellectual genealogy. Conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, which came of age in the 19th century, are all rooted in rich philosophical traditions, and one can readily identify philosophers and thinkers who developed these ideas with great rigor. Fascism, which emerged in the 20th century, lacks an intellectual tradition. In fact, it has no fixed ideology or philosophy at its center. Rather, fascism is a congeries of actions, dispositions, and political behaviors from which one can infer certain ideas, but it seems to lack a distinct, coherent philosophy at its core. According to historian Robert Paxton, who is a seminal thinker on fascism, in his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, he says, quote, "Fascist leaders made no secret of having no program," end quote. This does sound, I think, a lot like Donald Trump. Speaking of fascism's emergence in the mid-20th century, Paxton says the following: "Fascism was a new invention created afresh for the era of mass politics. It sought to appeal mainly to the emotions by the use of ritual, carefully staged ceremonies, and intensely charged rhetoric. Fascism does not rest explicitly upon an elaborated philosophical system, but rather upon feelings about master races, their unjust lot, and their predominance over inferior people. At bottom, it is a passionate nationalism. Allied to it is a conspiratorial and Manichaean view of history as a battle between good and evil camps, between the pure and the corrupt, in which one's community or nation has been the victim, end quote. Fascism, Paxton argues, is founded in what he refers to as mobilizing passions. Mobilizing passions. In his view, fascism is more a matter, again, of the gut than it is of the brain. Among its mobilizing passions are the following, and I'll give you a roster. 1, a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions. 2, the primacy of the group towards which one has duties superior to the right and the subordination of individuals to it. 3, the belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external. 4, dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences. 5, the need for closer integration of a pure community by consent if possible or violence if necessary. 6, the need for authority by natural chiefs, always male, culminating in a national chieftain who alone is capable of incarnating the group's historical destiny. 7, the superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason. 8, the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will when they are devoted to the group's success. And 9th and last, the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, end quote. So, does Donald Trump and the movement he leads exemplify these, quote, mobilizing passions? Does he reflect the personality and tactics of a fascist leader? In my view, he bears too much in common for us to write off this identification or rest easily. Trump presents himself, again, as an authoritarian leader who is dismissive, contemptuous of democratic institutions. He postures himself as an outsider who will dismantle the establishment. In his self-aggrandizement and appeals to his own greatness, he seems to posture himself above the law and political conventions. He pledges to crack down on a free press by toughening libel laws. He will ethnically cleanse 11 million illegals and strip the citizenship of the children of such illegals. He will commit war crimes through killing family members of terrorists, though they be innocent of any wrongdoing, and vies to upstage his adversaries in the use of torture, though it violates international and federal law, the Geneva Conventions, and the Military Code of Conduct. All this bravado makes him look tough in the eyes of his followers. He is more interested in railing against political correctness than he is in abiding by the fine print of the U.S. Constitution. As noted, he speaks to the victimization of America at the hands of enemies, foreign and domestic, as well as the victimized status of his devotees. He speaks as a savior to those who feel themselves victimized and left behind by the American economy and by those who control it, and those who feel the door to a more hopeful future has been slammed shut. If the fascists of Europe and destruction of the Jews, Trump, I would say, is racist as well, though I am not drawing an identity between Trump and Nazism. But as we know, older whites are the core of his constituency. His appeal to minorities is understandably minimal. This appeal, we should not forget, is strengthened by his nonsensical and racist demand back in 2002 that Barack Obama display his birth certificate and his grades at Harvard. This signaled to the whites who would be his cohort that the first black president was not only literally un-American, but that he was intellectually inferior to them despite being a graduate of Harvard Law School. The racist dynamics are very clear. It is no accident that Trump is a favorite of white supremacists and hedged on disavowing the endorsement of David Duke, a former wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Now here, I should say, is an interesting and important historical tie-in. Though fascism was a European creation, Robert Paxton again notes that perhaps the first precursor of fascism was spawned here in the United States in the form of the Ku Klux Klan. As he observes, quote, by their techniques of intimidation and their conviction that violence was justified in the cause of their group's destiny, the first version of the Klan in the defeated American South was arguably a remarkable preview of the way fascist movements were to function in interwar Europe, end quote. Very interesting historical connection. When we think of intimidation and violence, it is not a far leap to Trump rallies with their violence, virulent rhetoric, and their theatrics. With regard to theatrics, Trump has arrived, in effect, on his massive jet plane, okay, to his awaiting, fawning crowds. So Trump has probably read little history. Paxton notes that this is exactly what the crowds did at Hitler's first election in 1932. They waited at the airport for Hitler to arrive on the plane. That Trump won the support in favor of white supremacists further points to his fascist credentials and the political ambiance that surrounds him. Trump's inconsistencies are duly noted, though the media have come to focus on them, I think, very late, a lapse in their responsibility, in my judgment. Years ago, Trump supported abortion rights. Now he's against them. He recently, as we know, proclaimed that women who have had abortions should be punished, and the next day retracted that proclamation. Now, let me say something. The day after, I thought it was very interesting, the very day after he made that proclamation that women who have abortions ought to be punished, Katha Pollitt, who writes for The Nation and has been here many times and is one of the most militant defenders of abortion rights without apology, said that Trump should never have retracted his original statement. And her reasoning was very interesting. She said, when indeed you have these anti-choice people standing in front of abortion clinics yelling murderer, murderer to any woman who's going through the door to seek abortion services, it becomes a stretch to claim that women do not have some responsibility in the fact of having an abortion. And in fact, she said the position of the Christian right and the right in general, by indeed not seeing women or demanding that women not be punished for having abortions, really is to see women as nothing but victims without any political agency of their own. It's an affront on the dignity of women, Katha Pollitt proclaimed. It's a very interesting point of view. And as she notes, a poor woman in Texas who has to travel for 3 days, giving up her work, spending a lot of money and so on, and dealing with indeed the abuse of the anti-choice cohort in order to enable abortion services is hardly a person without agency who is a defenseless victim. And by saying women ought not to be punished, you're turning them into, again, creatures who are worthy of nothing but patronizing protection, right, from male patriarchs, right, and denying that. It was a very interesting take, I thought. She thought Trump should never have retracted his initial commitment, however ill-thought it was. And I suspect he hasn't really thought very much about this issue, which is true about most things, okay? Okay, moving on. He is given, in terms of inconsistencies, he has given lots of money to candidates, but now says he opposes such contributions. He, in effect, is a relentless womanizer who's been married 3 times, but now asserts that he loves evangelical Christians, and the Bible, he says, is great, even better than his book, The Art of the Deal, right? I mean, the arrogance is just so incredibly unbridled, it just is, it's beyond belief. Trump's inconsistency, preposterous assertions, deviation from the standard conservative line, his political ignorance, and his irrationalism, when melded to his popularity, show that his political positions, as noted, are irrelevant, again, to his appeal among his followers, or almost irrelevant. In line with fascism, his appeal in great measure emerges from the fact that his constituency sees him again as a strong man who defies convention and who speaks to the victimization of a working and lower middle class, which is anxious, angry, and left behind in an economy that has failed them and in an America that they do not recognize anymore. So, The question is, does Trump the man fit the definition of a fascist? In my personal opinion, he does indeed comes very close with pronounced fascistic tendencies. He is fascistic not in the mold of Adolf Hitler, but more approximately in the mold of Benito Mussolini. In the words of Hannah Arendt, the great political theorist, quote, Mussolini was probably the first party leader who consciously rejected a formal program and replaced it with inspired leadership and action alone, end quote. And I think that would serve as a pretty good description of Donald Trump as well. However, it's essential to note that for fascism to take over requires not only fascist leadership, but the political, social, and economic conditions that enable fascism to take hold. Assessing the state of society as a whole is far more difficult than assessing the personality and methods of a single individual, as hard indeed as that may be. As noted, the state of American society in the present is far different from that of Europe after the devastation of World War I. The Great War had left Europe exhausted, disillusioned, and had destroyed belief in progress. Germany had been defeated catastrophically in the war, after which it suffered from the economic depression and a sense of national humiliation. Italy was on the brink of civil war in 1919. There was mass reaction against existing regimes and existing constitutions. Politically, Europe was severely divided. Liberals failed to gain power, and Bolshevism had taken over in Russia, while conservatives, with European monarchies destroyed, could not gain a foothold either. The disarray and despair opened the door for fascism and fascist leaders. In major respects, contemporary America is different. Despite laments about America's decline, we do maintain the world's largest economy and the world's strongest military by far. But ultimately our resilience against the fascist proclivities of Donald Trump is rooted in the viability, depth, and stability of our democratic institutions. That's where the future rests. Again, we cannot identify, in my view, with the near-apocalyptic state of Europe after the First World War. But I think there are enough weaknesses in our democratic fiber to put us on high alert. Let me raise some concerns, many of which I'm sure are familiar to us. In terms of the importance of underlying institutions and their solidity, let me make a very rough and perhaps not particularly useful historical analogy. The Roman Empire was able to survive 400 years with crazy emperors at the top, in part because it had a very solid civil service below that was able to deploy the needs of a vast empire of 100 million people. The question we confront is, what is the solidity and strength and viability and resilience of America's democratic institutions with regard to the future if Donald Trump should be our next president? Let me raise some of the aspects about our current political moment more broadly, politically. First, contextually, Trump is emerging at a time that puts him in very good company. Historically, the period between the wars was a period when Western Europe was swelling with refugees from Eastern Europe, mostly Jews from Eastern Europe who had arrived in the decades before. And the reaction then is similar to the reaction in Europe now with the influx of Muslim refugees. That refugee flow has inspired, as we know, xenophobic and fascistic backlashes and anti-immigrant parties throughout Europe. Fascist-like parties have arisen in France, Holland, in Hungary, which has built a fence, by the way, to keep migrants out, and even liberal Denmark has engaged in xenophobic fear-mongering. This atmosphere abroad, I think, allies with Trump's rants here at home, and he has harnessed the xenophobia in Europe to strengthen his own racist and anti-immigrant pronouncements. It is true that Trump has not called for a single-party state, as did Mussolini and Hitler. In fact, Trump postures himself as an anti-politics politician, which is nevertheless in accord with the temper of fascism as implied. The groundwork was laid for Trump when the Republican Party, with the election of Barack Obama, dedicated itself to blocking virtually every initiative he has made for seemingly no other reason than the fact that Obama has made it. It was Senator Mitch McConnell who declared back then that his aim was to ensure that Obama would not have a second term. Now, let me say, this pronouncement doesn't say much for healthy democratic governance or statesmanship. And then, with the emergence of the Tea Party, whatever moderation there may have been in the Republican Party was hijacked by this movement, which essentially declared that mediation and compromise, which are the lifeblood of democracy, is virtually an act of treason. The Tea Party has paralyzed the so-called establishment wing of the Republican Party so that it can't even fulfill its constitutionally mandated function of giving its advice and consent on a Supreme Court nominee. And one feels that it's the Republicans, it's not that they just don't want to basically hold hearings to vet Obama's nominee for the Supreme Court. My feeling is that they can't do it, that they are held by the maw of the Tea Party in such a way that they can't, in effect, fulfill their constitutional function. So paralyzed has the party and our system become. It is this stagnation of government, this vacuum, this attack of government from within, which Trump, the strongman, plays into and enables him to gain traction. It is this paralysis of the democratic process at the federal level which resonates with the conditions which give rise to fascism. Of course, there's more. In some ways, we can see the acclaim of Donald Trump as the result of the dispossessed. It is a constituency, again, previously silent and powerless, of older white, undereducated males whom the new economy has left behind. It's a constituency brimming with anger and frustration, which is noted Trump readily exploits with appeals to power and with fear-mongering and racist demonization. It is a constituency which has been, for the most part, neglected by the elites in both the Republican and Democratic parties. The Democratic Party is not blameless here, friends. I remember the Democratic Party used to present itself, and still does, but did with greater, I think, authenticity in decades past, to be the party representing the interests of the working man. Boy, how my mother and father loved FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, right? For that reason. My father was an immigrant coming from the Ukraine. He was a small businessman. FDR was the hero to him as he was to so many, many other people. But you know, whatever claims the Democratic Party makes with regard to being the champions of the working and middle class, I think basically are vacuous to a great degree. Decades ago, after LBJ, they made the commitment to really garner new constituents by appealing to white professional suburbanites. You know, that really has been the target, I think, of Democratic recruiting, and in that sense have left by the wayside their traditional constituency of the working class and the struggling middle class, and so on and so forth. The Democratic Party here is by no means innocent. It may account in great measure for the incredible success of Bernie Sanders. But beyond these major dynamics, all of which collude with a fascist profile, is the anti-intellectualism of Trump's appeal. Again, fascism is a movement of action, not ideas, and Trump fulfills this role very amply. The anti-intellectualism which Trump exemplifies and is characteristic of his followers is not something he created, but something that he inherited, something that was already present, which in fact he has very effectively exploited. Since the 1980s, augmented by the entry of the evangelical subculture into the political fray, the Republican Party has excoriated what it referred to as, quote, East Coast pointy-headed intellectuals, end quote. It's a form of name-calling used to denigrate liberals and, beyond that, education broadly, knowledge, and ultimately the reality-based world, as George Bush had put it. And this name-calling has been tragically successful. It has resulted in tirades attacking Darwinism and endless attempts to get creationism into the schools and to deny climate change, on which the fate of the planet depends. Though I could go on and on, let it be said that anti-intellectualism is not good for democracy, but dovetails very well with an emotionally based fascist outlook. I think it was Voltaire who said that the person who's willing to engage and basically confirm absurdities is a person who is set and primed to commit atrocities, okay? And this is sort of, one gets a feeling of that in the air. Trump has succeeded in yoking together grassroots rage with this anti-intellectualism. So, where does this leave us? I believe it leaves us in a more uncomfortable place than we would like to be. Our political future rests uneasily, I believe, on certain contingencies on which we have to place a great deal of hope. And just this past week, the surreal has become fact, and Donald Trump, as we know, is now the Republican candidate for the presidency. It is also likely, but not uncertain, that the Democratic candidate, which will probably be Hillary Clinton, will take the White House. Indeed, Trump has so alienated minorities and women that demographics will most likely cause him to lose the presidential election. After Mitt Romney's defeat in 2012, the Republican establishment realized that if it was going to succeed in the future, that it would have to reach out to the large and growing Hispanic population, which the Trump campaign has totally sabotaged. Moreover, through his own ego and ignorance, Trump seems so unable to stop sticking his foot in his mouth, but by the time that he reaches the convention in Cleveland, we assume he might be very damaged goods. The prediction is that Trump will lose the national election and America will be spared a fascist president in the White House. There is much talk about how, with Donald Trump, the Republican Party is imploding. It will both reinvent itself and restore to prominence a moderate wing that it once had, or it will dissolve and disappear. Or maybe it might even become more extreme and so disaffect in cycles an increasingly larger number of Americans. Well, I personally hope this likely scenario eventuates and Trump loses the presidential race. Note that we should not be partisan from the platform. But, have you got that? Give me a little grace here. Okay, but you know, sometimes, and I really have, up until this moment, I've been a leader for over 40 years, I have never spoken in a partisan way from the platform because I honor that prohibition religiously. But you know, sometimes you just can't avoid facts to basically maintain that neutrality and purity in the face of the dangers we face, I think is something, a luxury that we simply cannot. So excuse me for that violation, but I think the press of the moment and the severe condition we're in requires that we give up a stance of absolute purity and neutrality in that regard. Okay, but if indeed this proves wrong and we do have a President Trump in the White House, I think all predictions go awry and our democracy will precariously hang in the balance. I mean, it's hard, nobody can predict the future, but it seems to me that a Trump presidency would certainly give rise to a strong, how should I say it, a strong undercurrent of chaos in American society, will further legitimate the racism which has become so virulent and indeed give license to racist violence and other forms of violence. It would at least give permission and cover, if not incentive, for that very, very destructive, and who knows where that's going to lead. One thing that frightens me most of all, okay, and it really does, one thing that frightens me most of all is how quickly human beings can change their allegiances and how political events can reverse themselves on a dime. As I recall, not a single pundit, there was one or two, maybe Brzezinski, as I recall, not a single pundit predicted the rapid dissolution of the Soviet Union, even right before it happened, and yet it quickly dissolved. In the annals of the Nazification of German life, many Germans who initially opposed Hitler rapidly changed their allegiances and supported him virulently after he took power. And I know through my study of genocide how many people who lived side by side with their neighbors for generations quickly, instantaneously turned to them and joined in the slaughter when the political winds, fanned by authoritarian and demagogic leadership, gave them the opportunity to do so. One has to ask the question, given our institutions, is there an element of Does it exist on solid ground or on shaky ground? And the dynamics exist underneath, which can cause us, basically, democratic institutions to collapse. This happens historically, and the question we have to ask and be concerned about is, could that happen here? And indeed, nobody, just as we couldn't predict the fall of the Soviet Union, I think nobody can accurately predict that future, but it's very worrisome given that political winds that move in one direction and have for a long time can suddenly change course and move in the opposite direction. But even if Trump loses, which is not certain, I think we cannot rest easily. Trumpism goes beyond the man and beyond the Republican Party. In my view, it is a symptom of the sclerotic state of American democracy. If I can say anything positive about the Trump phenomenon, it is that it has unmasked how our economy and our political systems fail to give a voice to those who are disenfranchised. But in truth, I argue, we are all disenfranchised. Functionally, America, I proclaim, is no longer truly a democracy, but an oligarchy and a plutocracy controlled by those who buy the political system and bend it to their own interests. Without being partisan, the immoral wealth disparity in this country and the power of the corporate elite and the plutocracy which owns the political system, as well as the media, is simply not compatible with a viable and healthy democracy. Absent the original sin of slavery, it is something that our founding fathers recognized when they set this nation in motion, that mass disparities in wealth were not healthy for democracy. At its best, the Trump phenomenon is a wake-up call to restore our democracy through a broad-based coalition and a grassroots movement which is awakened to the dangers we confront. Labeling Trump a fascist, I think, can give urgency to that uprising in the name of the restoration of democracy in America. America may never have seen the likes of Donald Trump, but we have confronted, in effect, the power of oligarchs before. The progressive movement of 1890 to 1920, which broke up monopolies, fought corruption, and worked to ensure direct democracy, was one such historical example. It was a movement in which, by the way, the ethical culture movement was deeply invested and in which it came of age. We have done it before, and we can do it again. Indeed, we must.